Hey Allison, how's it going?
Good, really good, thanks.
Hey,
How's work going?
oh, not bad. Almost done for the day. So I suppose it's the evening over there, though.
Yeah, yeah, it's lovely. It's been quite mild today.
Has it?
Yeah.
The what do you think, Alan? Since you were the one that pointed this paper out, I was not actually aware of Weaver's 1947 before you actually sent it to me. So, so that's really that's good.
No, I think that's good. um, yeah, because I just thought it was a really interesting paper because it's probably where our thinking around simple, complicated, and complex systems comes from, and it's the beginning of a paradigm shift, which I think subsequent authors have sort of said, look. Although he was indicating that there is a paradigm shift and laid out a nice challenge for future scientists, it actually hasn't ever been taken up. Or it's been taken up by a number of people, but you've still got people who sit inside the disorganized complexity sort of paradigm and relying heavily on stats and what have you. So it's quite interesting that hasn't been taken up. But I think for me, it was really interesting to read something from emerging out of the 1940s, because so many of the readings that you look at say that complexity is a relatively recent phenomena. And here it is, somebody going back a little bit further. And also, it's a product of its time. So it's kind of interesting to look at some of the assumptions. People think at 1948, it's just after the war, and the computers are just coming onto the scene. So it's quite nice to sort of read somebody of that era, and it's predating the 60s and 70s paradigm shift, like the post-structuralist, postmodernist sort of attack on certainty and what have you. So there's his beliefs in science. It's kind of interesting to read something way before some of those critiques and started to be mounted against science. So, that's why I just thought it was a really interesting article. And I think a nice point to start is that question. How does it conceptualize science, the future of science?
So yeah, coming at that, that's something that very, hit me kind of exactly what you were talking about. In 47, especially in post-World War II, you would think it's interesting that came out. First of all, science, I think one of the primary determinants of science is that it gives us specific, prescribed answers to what is perceived as simple questions. And colloquially, what not science is something that cannot give precise answers to those questions. And this says that basically it's not quite the answer. And that's where I get hung up as well. Because, I come from a biomechanics perspective where everything is Newtonian mechanics. Everything kicks out exactly what you're supposed to be able to calculate something before you actually do it. And it's supposed to work exactly how you calculated it. But really, if you look at a lot of even his examples, you see that that's not necessarily the case for everything. And there are some things that are way more complex than that, especially when you bring in a lot of different variables. I think that was really interesting. 72 years ago, somebody talking about that. And, we still haven't had a really good discussion about that within education. I mean, we have been talking about it, but it isn't very well known. What do you think, Mike? Mike, do you have anything to add? I don't know if you can hear us.
So no, I was looking at Alison to speak.
Oh, okay.
I've got something really, I was going to say I predate, but I don't know Haydn's birth date. But because when I was reading it, I couldn't understand, so I was going to come back at you. I hate asking a question to answer a question, but first of all, I was confused about disorganized and organized complexity. And then I went to Haydn's Creation. I'm not going to sing it, but I can't see without my glasses. But then it says, in the beginning, the beginning of it is called Representation of Chaos. And so I was just trying to pretend I was reading it in words to understand where did this chaos come from. And the chaos helped me make sense of the disorganized complexity, because everything was sort of helter-skelter, just like the article is talking about, and saying there's lots of different things, but then if you look at them collectively, they make more sense. So as I took each line of Haydn's chaos, it made me think, well, did he go from theory in education or science to write his music? Because it's complexity science in the first part of his of the creation. It's just quite interesting. And that then led me over to Heisenberg, which sort of helped me make a bit better sense of what we're doing with Weaver here. So, I mean, for me, I always tend to have to dig around before I come back up.
Yeah.
But the quote from the Weaver where he says, all progress must be accomplished in a world in which modern science is an inescapable, ever-expanding influence. I just started to play and take out the modern science and then put in education or put in music or put in life. And it just seems to be kind of interchangeable, or it's helping me to come back around. So I'm feeling a little bit more brave to now better understand disorganized and organized complexity. But I'm quite happy if one of our experts just gives me a nice succinct sentence.
Yeah, I see.
Yes, I would quite like that as well. And what do you guys see this idea of disorganized and organized complexity? Because I'm not sure, I sort of got it.
I mean, I think the Weaver, the old school Weaver, he talks about ants. Doesn't he talk about ants and how ants, if they're all going up together, they look like they're having a nightmare when you see them all doing their own individual thing. But then if you take a step further back, and that could be the disorganized, is that it, Mike? And then when you see them actually as a collective, then it could be organized. It could be seen as complexity, which is it's seemingly disorganized at individual level, but collectively, actually, they're working well with parity together.
Within ant colonies, specifically, their self-organization is based on very simple rules. And so while one ant might seem very disorganized, she's laying down a centric, more often it's female. So she's laying down a pheromone scent, not necessarily knowing where they're going. But over a certain amount of time, they hit the objective they want, and then they go back to the hive, laying down that familiar, that pheromone. Over time, that disorganization becomes organized through that self-organizing event of probability. The more times they go to that proper spot to get the food, coming back, the stronger the pheromone scent is for everybody else to go back to that source. And you get these trails that, these chemical trails to the food source. So yeah, you have highly disorganized behavior that is following very simple rules that over time create an order at the larger system. So stepping back, you're able to see, okay, now I see how everything is going. We have trails going to food. We have these tunnels that are being dug. We have certain rearing mechanisms that are coming about. So the individual isn't necessarily organized, but the overall organism or the system is organized. That's how I get it. That's how I perceive it, sorry.
I wonder if that whole paper is based on perception, because it just struck me that the end seemed far more simplistic and oversimplified than where the directions were going during the paper.
Did I get?
It just seemed to be a slightly more simplistic ending, and I wondered if it was about moralistic values, or if it's just a bit like the journey that Jesse's described, where in actual fact the paper was there were tensions between disorganized and organized aspects of complexity coming through, where there was a favored scientific method of science. However, there was a perceived value tension clash, which might not actually be a tension. It's just the fact that it's more complex than the linear dualistic position that was provided at the end. So for us to progress science, we probably need our morals to catch up. Well, that was strikingly linear from quite a complex conversation prior to.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was going back to Mike's question of what the difference is, and I think it's a really good, challenging question, because there are elements of what he says which we often use as examples of complex systems, like he says in disorganized complexity, you can have patterns of order which you can then determine through statistical means. So across, say, as his example there, a population, we know that a percentage of people will be dying through heart attacks. So even though we don't know what the individual probability of individual sort of heart attacks will be, or know that in a group, it'll fall into some sort of regular patterns of which we can predict and work mathematically, which I kind of thought was interesting. But the essential difference between the two of them, which I think you sort of started, and Mike will be pleased because he always is always about self-organization, is that notion that in disorganized complexity, the individual behavior is erratic, versus in organized complexity, it is a lot more connected, and I think the individual agent is self-organizing in some way. It's not to say that in the only difference that I can see in what Weaver writes is that his notion that the individual demonstrates erratic behavior, and then as opposed to an organized complexity, it's a lot more organized or self-organizing.
Well, I think that's what he meant, and I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with him. I suppose that was where I was. But going back to the point where he obviously was shooting into the wind, in the sense that, the point that you've made is that 70 years later, or Jesse made, is that there are still key points that he's actually raised there that have not really been taken on board. So I think that probably, we could probably discuss for a long time the idea of organized and disorganized complexity. Because I suppose in a way, by putting, if you put structures in place, so Biesta talks about, and I'm not sure he took it from, but the idea that things are more probabilistic and things are, less probabilistic. And I think if you put structures in place, and the boundaries are quite tight, even although people, I would argue, are still self-organizing, you are going to, if we take it with people, you are going to get more organization because of the nature of the boundaries and the probability of things happening. Whereas if you set up different situations, they have the potential to be more chaotic and less likely to be organized. So I think there's something about organization being about predictability and disorganization having the potential of unpredictability. I don't know. You know, and it's this binary thing that we just have to be careful about, you know, which you told me many years ago, Alan.
You know, I've written about that with the National Board Certified Teachers in the United States, and how they have 5 core principles. And what I've written about is very similar to what Mike's talking about, that setting up rules, very specific rules or boundaries, allows a self-organization process within those boundaries to be predictable. So I think the analogy, I actually used ants, that it is predictable where are they going to go to find food, right? If you set up certain boundaries, let's say you put a wall around a colony and you only have 2 food sources, well, you can predict pretty much where those trails are going to be. You can predict based upon those boundaries in place. So without boundaries, yeah, we can have complexity, we can have self-organization and emergence go completely wild, completely disorganized or self-organized. But if you actually place certain boundaries, you can put these things within a realm of predictability. And I think it's exactly what Mike's alluded to there, that you can have a certain amount of probability or predictability within any given system if you put up appropriate boundaries for it.
And I think so, and it's certainly something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I've gone away and got a book that you go back to that question of what, in a sense, is science and what is not science. And I was reading about, I've come across in the last 6 months more book about complexity leadership than I'd ever really been aware of. And that there's a whole area about complex adaptive leadership, which there's quite a number of people writing about. But one of the key bits, and it's the first time I've read this, and I'm really keen to sort of, in the notes when Morrison, who wrote a book called School Leadership and Complexity Theory about 15 years ago, he refers to work by Merry in 1995 that, and let's go back to this idea of science, who takes forward a project suggesting that there's 9 major differences between human organizations and the complex adaptive systems of nature. And I think there's a really interesting point here. So going back to the ants and going back to humans, and I'm not going to read out the 9 different things, but what this Merry person has suggested is that humans' capacity for cognitive adaptability is different from almost the rest of nature. And therefore, although we can see complexity in, you know, so I've got a son who's doing earth sciences, and you can see the complexity over millions of years of how the earth naturally, or, you know, has evolved. But the point that I'm grappling with is this, that humans, going back to Alan's point, why I'm so interested in the notion of self-organization is that that's something that, you know, part of which might be unconscious, but we also have the capacity to consciously think differently, to do things differently. So going back to the ants, Jesse, the ants, there will be the odd ant that does something different, but in the main, the boundaries, the parameters, the context will lead them to organize in a certain way. Whereas we have got people like Hitler, we have got people like Stalin, who in statistical terms would be considered outliers, and therefore we will not have them as part of the project. We will just drop them because there's only one of them. But because that one person is so crazy and so different, they change the whole nature of the way the world is. So I think there's a really interesting point here about that, you know, the nature of organized complexity and the extent to which ants, for example, would be drawn into it, and how humans, as we become increasingly more democratic, and the narrative of choice in the individual, if that becomes the way we look at everything, you can see how our ability to cognitively adapt and be different will perhaps start to knock that out.
Yep.
So I think that goes back to my point about science. So therefore, I'm not sure that science in its traditional form does a very good job of what I'm talking about there. Because it's about quantifying things.
Yep.
And I think there's elements within that are actually not particularly quantifiable.
Yeah.
So,
and I had this, Alan, do you remember about 6 years ago, I emailed you and I was just like, hey, wanted to talk to you about complexity. And I think I made the same point that, ants, I think I've been preoccupied with ants for the past 10 years. Anyways, I keep bees too. So anyways, I was preoccupied with small changes affecting, or small rules, simple rules affecting group behavior. And the first thing Alan told me, was people don't make simple, they don't obey simple rules. You can't apply that here. And so my thinking has changed about that. And you're absolutely right, Mike. I think my thinking about it has changed, that human consciousness is actually just one of the constraints that has allowed our self-organization to differ from what other organisms within nature do. So I don't know where I was going with that.
Yeah,
I've changed my thought.
Yeah.
So that leads into my next question. What you guys were just talking about. Does complexity thinking completely subvert reductionism? Can we be reductive?
What do you mean by
I think
reductionism?
by definition, we have to be reductive. Because, and it may be a different definition of reduction, but none of us who are talking now are smart enough to cope with all the complexity there. Our whole life, as human beings, we filter everything. We have to.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, our heads would just explode. So therefore, it may not be the same definition, but we must reduce we perhaps must embrace complexity. But I think you could argue that the nature of the scientific way of reducing complexity into these individual parts and whatever is not what we should be doing in a complex sense, but we still have to reduce it.
Yeah.
Because why? Because we wouldn't exist. Because I don't know if that answers that, but I think it throws it up as
Yeah, I would say that what complexity does is it draws our attention to the politics of reduction. So, as Mike says, we know in a sports setting, skilled performers are not quicker thinkers. They just know what information to attend to and what that information means, so they can make more effective decisions. And so it's about being able to sense, perceive, and make the right decisions. And I think what complexity allows us to do is that, as Mike said, in order to operate in everyday life, we're constantly reducing the complexity of everyday living down to, because what we learn to do is attend to the key information that we need in order to go on with our lives. What I think a complexity framework allows us to do is think about how we're reducing that information, what information we're attending to, and what information is being lost or is redundant, and is there any important information in that? And especially to go back to your previous point, because humans are so complex, we use so many different ways of and frameworks, philosophical beliefs and assumptions and what have you to to shape that reduction, then it's worth us reflecting on, well, why did we come to that conclusion and not this conclusion? And that's how I'd see that complexity influences reduction.
So
It's interesting.
I think it's acknowledging complexity, whereas I think reductionism, to some extent, I don't think anybody ever would not acknowledge, going way back in time, that the world is not complex. It just depends how you define it. But I think one of the bits that we seem to have done as a whole human race is we ignore complexity to some extent, and we therefore reduce it. And I think there's a difference between, just as you said, Al, acknowledging the complexity that then informs, or you become more informed, therefore, as to how you reduce that. As opposed to, I suppose, in Scotland, we have a saying called "it's aye been," in that it's always been like that, So that's what, you go to schools and go, it's aye been this way. And to some extent, that's just, we're going to ignore the complexity and we're just going to keep going on the same route. Of course, what's happening now is that with globalization, the good and the bad of it, and the opportunity to do things like this, we will increasingly have to acknowledge and therefore embrace notions around complexity. And I think, and I know I'm jumping a wee bit here, but I do think one of the really interesting points that Weaver's paper raised was this idea of either interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary working, and how world wars, we make the issues that we have to address so big and so immediate that actually we embrace complexity at that point. Whereas to some extent we sort of ignore it. So I did like the point and how Weaver was moving away from a reductionist notion, because if we all sit down in our different specialisms and come together, and that, I think there's a rhetoric around that, but I think we still reduce the number of people, or we reduce it into one way of thinking. And I think that move towards having to work with big world problems that are complex, and we acknowledge that they're complex, is one example. Sorry, I jumped about there, but hey.
No, that's all right. Can I go back to one point, which I think I agree with Mike in that we normally frame reductionism in a negative way, and so I think there are some assumptions within that critique of reductionism, and I think it's one of the things that in this article is brought out between what organized and disorganized complexity. In one sense, the shift is that I think reductionism has as its key assumption that of a sense of sameness. There's an ideal, a sameness. And so in trying to reduce something, the complexity of something down, is trying to find that sameness. The average is Weaver talks about here. What is the average? What's that underpinning rule? You peel away all the difference to find that essence. I think what complexity does is it operates from a different set of assumptions, which is difference is normal. Difference, there is no underpinning essence or average. There's only ever difference. Now that might not be purely complexity, but I'm bringing in a bit of more modern philosophy there. But I think that's kind of what he's implying there. That shift is a sense of the search for sameness as opposed to the search for difference. As Mike said, the advantage of a team that bring in different perspectives is that you're valuing that difference, as opposed to just looking at specialists who are refining the sameness, trying to a high degree, trying to get the essence of something as opposed to bringing together difference as a way of solving problems.
I mean, I think just what you're talking about there is that the reductionism that you've highlighted from traditional thinking, in a sense, is based on the fact that we think that the world is set, that we know what the world is, and therefore, if we know what the world is, and if we know what everything, we know everything that we need to know. Therefore, because we know that, to find the similarities, is the sameness, is a good thing, because so it's predicated on a, well, I think we would all agree, on almost a false paradigm. Because the argument is actually, certainly from a human perspective, it would seem pretty clear to us that we don't know what everything is. Right. And the more that we get groups of people coming together, the more we're starting to create things that 50 years ago you'd say that wouldn't happen. Yeah. So I think...
Well, it's based on Plato's notion of ideal forms too, isn't it? Yeah. That, everything else is a variation from the ideal. Therefore, through statistics and what have you, you can find that ideal form. Whereas in complexity and the concept of difference is that, there's no ideal form.
Yes.
There's a variation.
So that leads into the third question that I had, which is, how do we rectify the ability to reduce a phenomenon with so that workable solutions can be found? So that idea of the ideal, we know that there is no real ideal. I mean, there is efficiency within self-organization and emergence. How do we come about and actually produce results? With the scientific method, we can look at a problem, we can reduce it, and we can come up with a solution to hand people for 95% of the population. How do we do that with complexity?
That tap into your ways of knowing. Earlier on when Alan was speaking, and I think you talked about attenuation regarding skill acquisition. Alan, yes? And I started to ask myself, is it not what we think, but is it more about how we think? So it wouldn't subvert reductionism, because if we adopted a complexity how we think rather than what we think, maybe we would find our own scientific method that was more of an essence-based approach, where things are continuously, if they're continuously emerging, our brains, like Mike said, wouldn't explode, because you wouldn't need to attenuate, because it's just all, it's perpetuating, and then you see things, but you don't have to perceive them, so you don't have to waste that linear approach of sequencing time and seeing what's redundant and what's relevant and so forth. So maybe the paradigm is a different way of how we think and not just what we think.
Yeah. And I think I don't know if this is saying the same thing, but the more I read about complexity, particularly in the applied, some of their more applied literature, particularly in business type stuff, there's so much of it about scenario thinking.
Yes.
So it instead of saying, so instead of us, and I think this is not a million miles away from what you're saying, Ali, that it's this idea that we're not looking for all the similarities and all the samenesses, as Alan was saying. What we're doing is we're acknowledging the differences, and therefore we are looking for powerful scenarios that help us understand this better. And therefore you're not, so the notion of generalizability is something that is, I don't think that's altogether a major problem, but the part of me always thinking that if we look at enough different scenarios, you start to see, because I don't think either Alan and I are suggesting there's no such thing as similarity or sameness. but the goal is not for everybody to be the same. So therefore, we have to find a mechanism to share the complexity and how complexity unfolds in situations. And I'm not sure what that looks like, because I think in a sense, it does change the narrative of science. It changes the narrative of the way that we look at things, which goes back to your point, Ali, about how we actually learn. So we're not learning in linear ways, but we're actually, as I think we do naturally, is that we take bits and bobs from different things.
Yes, and for me, it just seems as if the construct is, there's a misalignment in the proposition, not just of the question, but maybe we're all struggling to find the mechanism, because maybe we have the innate mechanism, but we've been given incorrect frameworks to try and place it and position it.
Yeah.
I think as a starting point, you're absolutely right. I mean, it took me probably 40 years to comfortably say the things I've just said there.
Well, I'm so far behind you guys, so this is all just new for me.
Yeah, I always love sport. To me, is like a metaphor for so much of this stuff, and maybe that's just my own background and passion. And I think about this because often in sport, when you see the top people in action, it's about just getting the job done. And so, our whole sort of move away technique's important perhaps, but in the end of the day, if, like look in the NBA at the moment, as long as the ball goes through the hole, who cares how it goes through the hole? And I think in that, there are 2 points that I think. Firstly is that notion that within a sort of a problem, a field, there'll be, say, a number of different attractors, just to use the language, so different ways that we could be within that environment. Now, some of those states will be more effective than others. And so that, then I think you can reflect on what is this action effective or not effective. And so, yes, we can exist in a number of different ways, but it's about reflecting on what'll have a better effect. And so then you get away from the binary. So in a classroom situation, I can do this. Everything has an effect, but we're then more interested in the effect size, what'll have the most, efficient or a good effect. And then I think also a second idea to bring in here is the notion of principles versus rules that, I've spoken about before. I think it's useful to define what are some of the principles of good practice as opposed to the rules and laws of good practice. And so rules and laws are often connected to predictability and certainty, as opposed to principles and what have you, which allow for uncertainty, but help us sort of increase the probability of an outcome. And I think that's kind of good. And it goes back to that example that I've used before. A good teacher should be like a chef as opposed to McDonald's worker. A chef is more likely to be following principles of good cooking as opposed to the McDonald's chef who's using the rules and the standards that they have to apply. They're still chefs, but it's a different order of being. And so I think in that answer your question, how do we rectify the ability to reduce phenomena? I think it's reducing it down to a set of principles based on an understanding that certain states, certain knowledge will have this effect as opposed to another effect, without sort of falling into the trap of certainty and predictability.
Whenever I describe complexity to my students, I kind of describe it as a cartoon. That when you look at a cartoon, it is the most simplified, reduced version of reality. There's no dirt. Things aren't rough. They tend to be uniform colors. and they're very simple, they're very predictable. But when you actually look at the real world, it's dirty, it's grimy, there's stuff. Even in the cleanest room, you have stuff. There's stuff. It's a complex idea of reality. And exactly what you were just saying, Alan, that when we come up with these solutions, you have to engage with that idea that it isn't necessarily those very simple representations of reality. Okay, so the next question that I have for you guys.
Are you marking? Are you grading us in this?
You're doing very well. You're doing very well. This manuscript was written in 1947, nearly 72 years ago. I'm wondering, what does everybody think are some of the universal themes that still are quite relevant in research today?
That's a big one.
Mm.
That's like an interview question.
Yeah, I think one of the points just to make that I'm not answering it, but it's just a point of that's in my head, is that I do think that we're talking about this being very old, but I think we have to contextualize 1947.
Yes.
And I think 1947 is a period where the world, or our world, was in a very different place than it had been for a long, long time. And I think to some extent, some of the ideas that we were putting forward are not that surprising, given the whole notion of this brave new world. And then things with the Cold War sort of, the boundaries came in again. So I think there was a period here. We always talk about the 60s, or the mad 60s in San Francisco and all that stuff, and the Beatles. But I do think there is that period. If you go and read in the UK, go and read the education policies of, Butler and whatever in the 1945, 46, they are, in essence, almost centuries ahead of their time, because there just was there was a relief, and there was an opening of making sure that we want the world to be a better place. So to some extent, I'm not completely surprised that there are some people like Weaver who will have written things like this.
And, I was thinking the same thing. If you look at self-organization and emergence, right, it's predicated on not major, but if you have significant constraint changes, you're going to have some self-organization emergence based around those changes. And right in the post-World War II, we had 50 million people that were gone.
Yeah.
50 million people from society were gone. We had entire cities that were gone. We had entire nation states that were trying to rebuild themselves under the Marshall Plan. You had all of these things that were coming together, and people could actually see there is a certain amount of self-organization that is occurring here. We can't dictate everything that is going on here. And I think that probably went into a lot of what he was observing.
Yeah, and I think what will have happened, I suppose, two things, is that one, the boundaries will have closed again as we went on. And I suppose another point is that actually embracing complexity, is it maybe not much harder than just going out to reduce it? So I think there's this opening, it closed again, and I think I can sort of almost understand why people don't want to embrace with complexity, because it's too hard. And I just think I think at that time, in that late 1940s, I think there was, as all the examples you've given there, Jesse, there was this opening.
Sure. But
I don't think it stayed open very long, and I think, yes, and as Tim said, the language of what Weaver's written is of its time.
yes.
And the thoughts, but I think there's things there certainly that I would like to just revisit, to just say, well, there clearly were people asking those questions, you know, at that time.
But it also sounds quite positive, given that it was quite a dark period of our global history. And do we still have that brightness? Because even though it has a cautionary tale underneath it, it's still looking forward in a positive fashion. Does complexity enable us to be a bit more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? I mean, is it a fundamentally healthy, open theory or set of theories?
I think, go back to where Alan started, I think the difficulty with, I think it's a paradigm shift. It's part of the shift. And I don't think it's a theory. I think we've got a problem. Now, I don't mean you've got a problem, but I think we've got a problem, is that we talk about complexity science, we talk about complexity thinking, we talk about complex adaptive systems, whatever. And I think the difficulty with complexity, it is a way of viewing the world, certainly a way of viewing the human world. But I think, going to your point, I don't think it is neither good or bad. It is a way of viewing the world. And it's a way of viewing the world, the human world, that's, I don't mean it's different, because I think there's so many people in the postmodern and post all the other stuff that I don't understand, who clearly are part of that shift towards complexity. But I think we have to be careful that we don't present complexity as a good thing. People self-organize in ways that are bad. And I think we can name lots of people that do that. Actually, we probably can talk about ourselves doing bad self-organizing at times. You know.
But science was doing some bad things back then, but it still seemed quite positive. It's meaning from the perspective of science, because a lot of good things have happened, and a lot of good things I'm hoping are still to happen through science. No,
I suppose that's the real modernist belief, isn't it? The modernist belief that we're getting better through science, things will improve, and it's for the common good. I did notice that in his writing, his belief that science is about, for the benefit of all humans, all people, and make it a better place, which I suppose is that huge springboard from the Second World War, which was the belief system embracing the Allies, to fight off the evil. I think for me, what's still relevant is that I think he's pointing to a deep ontological shift, a questioning of ontology, that, about the difference between the elements. Are they just disorganized, random, erratic interactions, or is it organized? And I think that's still relevant. We still now have got, that's a fundamental belief that we're connected, and it's those connections that matter, and that those elements are not just erratic, but they're self-organizing. I think that is still deeply relevant in what he's saying, and that the other thing that I think is still relevant is he's talking about problems, in that we tend to gravitate towards simple problems, and we've solved a lot of simple problems, and that we avoid those really complex problems of organized complexity. Now, I think that's still relevant today, but we've probably managed it in a very different way. That real positive modernist outlook on life, which I'd call was sort of really embraced in sort of liberal ideology, is we're now living in a sort of a very post-liberal world, and so those ideas have been replaced by sort of a new liberalism or neoliberalism as a way of trying to manage and solve those problems. So that's, I think, one way of trying to deal with organized complexity in contemporary life. And we don't really have a mechanism at the moment to be able to we can critique it, but we can't change it, because that's what's emerged. Highly managed situations, but there's within that much more of an appreciation. I think one thing that he doesn't, and he doesn't mean to, avoid it. It just hasn't come in yet. But it's that the individual, the self-organizing individual, driven by desire, their own self-interest and what have you, that's kind of missing from there. There's very much, I think, the 1940s broader vision that we're all working for a better world. And I think what's evolved in the last, say, 30 years is much more of an individualized, self-interested politics where, you know, what's in it for me sort of thing. And I'd call that a lifestyle politics, which governs us now. You know, that's what I think.
Would his do better in a sort of a China approach? You know, when they take centuries to philosophies rather than us flipping everything every time there's a new government. Does complexity look and feel different? I'm not supposed to use the word better, and I get it, Mike, but wouldn't it be easier to have a complexity conversation in China? Because they take generations, they look at change. And they look at conceptual change over generations. They don't look at it over everything that was done by the previous political party we're going to reverse. Not that they ever have more than one anyway, but they seem to, they're more patient in addressing issues and letting things emerge. And they use a little bit of organized and disorganized complexity through their principles of policy.
I think it's what, just go back to what Mike said before, I think as a worldview, it holds no moral stance on anything.
Mm-hmm.
What China would do is it just brings a different set of ideologies to bear, and so the individual consciousness, then what emerges from that deep network of ideologies is different to, say, Western ways of thinking. So it may be easier to have that conversation, but certainly the way the individual's produced is really a product of those deep networks of power relations, which bring together different ideologies, different ways of thinking that influence who we are.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the Chinese students that I know, though I know this is not quite what you meant, but the thought.
Oh. Don't bring up Chinese students. They was cut off just like that. We're being monitored.
The collective, it's the collective mindsets. So I was giving a tangible example, but is the collective, I mean, this is where Weaver was heading. He was insinuating that the collective mindset and the propensity to be slightly more altruistic collectively is going to be to the betterment. And that's, I think that's something that still translates to today when Jesse's saying, you know, from there to this side of the century and another century. I mean, we still recognize that that's valuable for people.
Oh, definitely. I think for me, and I always use Anthony Giddens there to understand that a lot of our education is grounded in an emancipatory politics. It's all about emancipation, about improving our life chances. Mm-hmm. But we haven't really addressed the question, what happens when we become emancipated? And, you know, the people of the Second World War were really fighting an emancipatory battle. In the 1950s, we're still very much grounded in how do we improve the life chances of people. But then that became, once people were emancipated, then it becomes more of a life politics. It's about lifestyle choice, not about life chances. So lifestyle choice, so it could be anything I want. And I don't think we're quite grappled with that. That's what I think modern contemporary societies are grappling with. And we kind of get, if I go one step further, I think we get kind of diverted off by lifestyle politics. You know, that it's not wrong, but you know, it's you know, the issues of lifestyle politics at the moment, you know, are not about the broader emancipatory quest in a sense. Being a bit cryptic there, but don't mean to be.
Yeah, I think you guys are talking about my thoughts about kind of the China approach as opposed to more Western approach. I do like the idea of longer, more patient emergence. When you don't allow the system to work out the bugs and you keep going back and forth, I think that's not advantageous. Now, within itself, that behavior is an emergent product of Western civilization. For some reason, coming back and forth. For some reason, I think that the long view of evolution and emergence is a little bit more productive as far as a process. The other thing is that when you look at economic systems, so a truly evolutionary economic system or emergent economic system, that's not something that necessarily a lot of people are going to want to live in because it requires failure. That's kind of self-organization. Emergence requires failure, and that when you have that type of system and it requires failure, that means you have a human cost of that failure. And I think that brings into, as far as our systems, a little bit more of complication as far as letting systems run. And that's where I come out on kind of the Western system. So you guys actually have answered all the questions, because I think that reductionism question, I had actually had another one about reductionism, but we hit it. So we've answered.
Who get the most marks? Who get the highest grade?
I think you did, Mike. It was graded on words.
And enthusiasm.
Yes, absolutely. So
it's reading.
So I was thinking that we might. Has everybody looked at the website yet?
Yeah, good effort. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's looking a little bit better than it did before. I think GoDaddy does pretty good with those templates. So I will post this one up. But what I was thinking about was maybe alternating. Every other meeting we'll have a presentation, maybe by a graduate student or one of us. And then the next meeting we'll have a reading. So we'll do an every other type of thing. That way we don't kind of get stuck in redundancy. Does that sound good to everybody?
Yep. As long as you organize it, yep.
Yeah, no problem. I don't like doing the every month. 4 weeks was a pretty quick turnaround, but every 2 months I can do that pretty well.
Yeah.
But I like doing this. I like the website and all that stuff. So I also think that, as far as when the conferences come up, this is a really good platform to work out if we want to do a symposium or write a paper. I think we could probably write a paper eventually, like we did a few years ago.
After tonight, it sounded like everybody was thinking of creating a design for complexity. I mean, that's such a what's that called? It's a contradiction in itself, but it doesn't matter. You can't say principle, you can't say this, but to sell a product just for people to chat and communicate, is it worth having a sort of a three-dimensional creation as an opener for something?
Maybe. I don't know. Something that probably will emerge. I would say give it some time.
I think the point, though, that I've become more and more aware of, just going back to the very beginning, this is a paradigm shift. We're part of a paradigm shift. So in a sense, we've got to position ourselves in that. This is the different way of looking at the world. And I think that's slightly different than saying, can we do games better? Or can we teach bits of PE better? This is actually, it's huge. And I think there's times where I've sort of not so much been frustrated, but realized that for example, in my own institution, I've done presentations where people have been quite interested, but it doesn't go anywhere because it's too big.
Yeah.
It is an enormous undertaking to say there's a completely different way to think about the human world. So I'm sort of intrigued by how we position ourselves within that, individually and collectively. And it's something I've probably been mulling about for the last sort of 6 months to a year. Yeah, and even within the I'll say within the context of education, it's difficult to see somebody, a group. I mean, Davis and Samura did their bit, but they've sort of gone off the radar a bit. Biesta wrote some stuff. Morrison wrote some stuff. You know, Mason, you know, there is nobody within education where you go, that person has really taken on complexity and stayed with it and moved on. It seems to be something that people have dipped in and out of. So I'm interested in exploring that. Is that what realistically is or can be our contribution to this? Because I mean, I know you're new to this, Alison, but obviously we've been talking and thinking and writing about these things. We're not far off a decade now, you know. So that's just me thinking out loud.
Yeah, in one sense, I slightly disagree, only because I think in health and physical education, we've got the constraints-led and nonlinear pedagogy guys. I think they're the most observable of actually actively using and developing pedagogy around these ideas. And it's, I agree with you, in a broader education sense, you don't see much, or you kind of see some of the ideas, but it's being generated through a different set of languages and ways of thinking than what we might. But yeah, within our field, I think the nonlinear pedagogy is probably the most interesting. But I don't see other people adding into that discussion. And I think we do probably need to add and broaden up that discussion a wee bit so that they don't become the attractor within the field, sort of like nonlinear pedagogy becomes. I just don't think we have enough people looking at it. We had because we're working on this project on, you know, developing, you know, shifting the whole notion of fundamental movement skills here in New Zealand. I suppose we're spending a lot of time reading the constraints-led literature and debating where some of the limitations and what have you are in that. And I think there are some big ones. They do a brilliant job of applying dynamical systems and, say, complexity to learning. But I don't see anyone writing to sort of say, this is the limitation of what they're talking about, and that's kind of needed. Yeah. And I think some of Dawn Penny's stuff around curriculum is really interesting, and but I don't think we've got the conceptual tools to go much further. You know, for instance, how do we critique something like physical literacy? You know, the best thing that I've been wanting to critique it with is the notion of a meme. You know, it is a meme that's taken off like crazy. Yeah. And to study it as a meme actually helps, you know, to look at the concept and why suddenly it's growing and become standard.
Yeah.
Like any meme, I think it'll morph into something different in the future. So there are some real hopes for me anyway, for the possibilities of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't meaning to be negative or even downbeat. I just think that even just what you've said there, Al, how in a way it would be an interesting experiment.
Knock at the door, I'll be back.
Just to try and look how complexity. Is that someone's phone? No? Where's Jesse's phone?
As you're waiting, Mike, is there still? I was playing with complexity yesterday when I was teaching parkour, and I did a parkour version where I had more parameters, and had a parkour version where I had fewer.
Yep.
And I surprised myself because the one where I gave greater structure and less ambiguity, they ended up having more self-organization.
Well, they did it with more self-organization. So my argument would be is that it's self-organized anyway.
Yeah.
But you know, so the fact that they're not doing stuff, they're still self-organizing. What I think you're saying is that their self-organization was better.
Yes. But I was scared to say better because of the neutrality from earlier. More things emerged. And as I have more parameters through the environment, but they felt they worked collectively together. So it was just. So
I think that in itself is really interesting. So all we can do as teachers is change the boundaries, change the class, change the boundaries, and I always like the idea of when we open the boundaries too far, it very often goes nowhere because people have got no idea what the boundaries are, and therefore they don't have any idea what they're meant to be doing, and you know the whole thing goes nowhere. There are times where that works brilliantly, but there's times where it goes completely. So that's why so much of the complexity stuff is contextual.
Yes.
Anyway.
Not only contextual, what's interesting about complexity is that it is so determinant on those initial conditions. So not just what the context is now, but what was the context when everything began. And then we can, you know, what's interesting is I have a lot of friends in physics, and they talk a lot about dynamic systems and even complexity theory. And what kind of, I don't know, maybe you guys could enlighten me on this, but they always talk about deterministic systems, that even in complex systems, they are still deterministic, that if they can determine the exact initial conditions, they should be able to predict the exact outcome of a system. Now, from what we do, I don't think we are necessarily deterministic. I think that the outcomes, I think that if you can identify the precise initial conditions, you might be able to come up with a very highly predictive model. But the problem is you can never actually account for every variable at the beginning, the initial conditions. What do you guys think?
I think that, going back to my point about the capacity of humans to self-organize in ways that are unpredictable is de facto non-deterministic. Yeah. So therefore, from my perspective, humans, down that, don't get me wrong, I think there are things, going to go back to almost what Ali was doing there, I think if we change certain parameters, so for example, it is pretty likely in most places around the world that if we get people to join something called the army, and that we're going to get you to march, and we're going to beat you if you don't march properly, that you probably will get people marching. So, you know, I think there are behaviors that we probably are able to elicit in probably quite a deterministic way. So, you know, however, I think there are, but it's that bit, it's not about, maybe you've got determined, maybe some things are quite deterministic. I don't know. But it's still that capacity for somebody to go, for the wee guy in China to go and stand 20 years from now in front of the tank in a country, you know, so.
I would I would say that's why there is no single thing called complexity theory. Several people have talked about, you've got the whole field of what you're talking about there, Jesse, is more the hard complexity,
Yes.
modeling, and it is predicated on assumption that, as you said, once we know all the variables, we can work it out. And there are people who are working on complex models and modeling behavior, and I think that's the field, and it's could possibly be a legitimate field, but it's not the field that we work in. And this self-complexity and this complexity thinking and those sorts of things, I think there's some common elements underpinning it, and there are some differences, and that's where maybe Weaver's notion of there's a middle ground for us in that we're not interested in trying to work out the laws of every interaction and then be able to factor them in. What we're trying to do is something different, using this to determine different ways of understanding, especially human activity.
Okay, so I guess I will be in contact with you guys. Do you guys have any graduate students that might want to give a presentation?
I do.
Do you?
Yeah.
Who? Was it Elizabeth or Elizabeth?
I'll do Elizabeth first, because she's just about to start with me in the fall, and then I'll do Penelope because she's got two. She's still new, but she's just coming. It's quite funny. She's very new to complexity, but she's very Greek, so she's just thrown herself in a very didactic fashion, and she hasn't quite even. She's just half a step behind me. She hasn't even. I'm kind of understanding the tensions, and she's not even aware of them.
Okay.
She's really bright and progressive, and we'll gobble this up.
Okay, so we'll have her present in about 8 weeks then, and I'll be getting a hold of her. Okay.
Perfect.
And we've got and don't forget we got Carlos here. So Carlos has been patiently listening.
Hello.
Here. Just give us a wave. That's fantastic.
Hello. How are you?
Hi
Thank
there.
you for having me. Yep.
And I know reading Carlos is coming up to the end of his first year, where we have a colloquium sort of system where he goes through an examination process, and what's required in that is he do a presentation. But I think from what we talked about just recently, he's been focusing on other reading and not necessarily complexity. So complexity will come into what he's doing later on, but not necessarily within this coming up to the colloquium provisional year review exam. So I'll continue to have a chat with him, see if he wants to do something, but at some stage it would be nice to have him present his work.
Okay, awesome.
What have you. So,
Could I today just
Yeah,
got
I still constructing the idea. Sorry.
sorry, go on, no.
Yeah, I'm still constructing the idea of complexity theory as a possible overfill or an overpassing of the term praxis. So that's my idea of complexity. I think you can try to understand praxis as from other perspective using complexity theory. That's my idea. So I think that's how I'm going to use complexity, connecting to praxis.
yeah.
Awesome.
So being Brazilian, he's worked his way through Paulo Ferreira's work and on praxis, and he's done all that reading. So has yet to sort of bring in the complexity concepts. Sorry, Mike, what were you going to say?
Sorry, I just today had a paper or a presentation been accepted for the World Association of Lesson Study with Paul McMillan, and it's about using complexity thinking to inform lesson study, and that I'll be doing that presentation in early September, and it would be useful for me and hopefully Paul if we could share it with you guys before we go there, and just get some feedback from you as well, because certainly from our perspective, I think that would be useful. So I just found that out today, and
Congratulations.
thank you.
Absolutely.
So that's, if that's possible. Clearly, if it doesn't work, but sort of end of August, would be good. From, if I know we want other people, and if it, I will not be offended if it doesn't work out.
Excellent.
Minor novices like me have got 100 years to catch up in 10, so it would be great if the expert goes first.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for taking some time. I know that Alan has to get up early in the morning to be at these, and then Mike has to be up late at night, so I appreciate it.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a
Speak
great
to you all
weekend,
soon.
guys.
Right.
Thanks,
Bye,
Carlos.
Carlos.
Bye, Carlos.
Bye,
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yep.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.
See you folks. Bye bye.